It's July 21st, 1456, and you're standing on the walls of Belgrade. You're one of 3,000 Hungarian defenders. Below you, stretching to the horizon like a black ocean, are 100,000 Ottoman soldiers. The greatest war machine on earth has arrived to crush you. You can see their massive cannons, each one capable of hurling stone balls that weigh half a ton. You've watched these guns pound your walls for 3 weeks. Every day, the stones come crashing down. Every night, you patch the holes with whatever you can find. You're exhausted, you're starving, your water is running low. And then, through the smoke and dust, you see something that makes your blood run cold. The Ottoman elite infantry, the Janissaries, are forming up for the final assault. These aren't ordinary soldiers. These are the Sultan's personal killers. They've conquered Constantinople. They've crushed the armies of Europe. They've never lost. And they're coming for you right now. But standing next to you on that crumbling wall is an old monk with a wooden cross in one hand and a sword in the other. His name is John Capistrano. He's 70 years old. He should be in a monastery somewhere, praying. Instead, he's here, and he's about to do something that will echo through history. He turns to you. His eyes are burning with something between madness and faith. He doesn't give a speech about honor or glory. He says something much simpler. God wills it. They cannot pass. And somehow, impossibly, you believe him, because in the next 18 hours, you're not going to lose Belgrade. You're going to break the Ottoman Empire. Before diving into this forgotten story of impossible survival, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of European military history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the moments that shaped Western civilization. To understand why the siege of Belgrade matters, you have to understand what was happening to Europe in 1456. This wasn't just another border war. This was an existential crisis. 3 years earlier, Constantinople had fallen. The city that had stood for 1,000 years, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, had been crushed by Ottoman cannons. The shockwave of that defeat rippled across every court in Christendom. If Constantinople could fall, anywhere could fall. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II wasn't just expanding. It was devouring. Mehmed wasn't content with controlling Anatolia and the Balkans. He wanted Rome itself. He wanted to turn St. Peter's Basilica into a mosque. He wanted to finish what the Arab invasions had started 700 years earlier at the Battle of Tours. And standing between Mehmed and the heart of Europe was a single fortress city on the Danube River, Belgrade. The name comes from the Serbian words for White City. It sat at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, a natural choke point that controlled all traffic between the Balkans and Hungary. Whoever held Belgrade held the keys to Central Europe. The fortress itself was formidable. Massive stone walls built on Roman foundations, a citadel perched on a cliff overlooking the rivers, deep ditches, and multiple layers of defense. But walls don't fight. Men do. And in the summer of 1456, Belgrade didn't have enough men. The Kingdom of Hungary was broke. Decades of fighting the Ottomans had drained the treasury. The king, Ladislaus V, was only 16 years old and had no military experience whatsoever. The Hungarian nobility, who were supposed to provide troops and funding, were too busy fighting each other over land and titles to care about the Turkish threat. The man nominally in charge of Hungary's defense was John Hunyadi. History remembers him as the White Knight of Wallachia, the last great crusader, the man who'd spent his entire life fighting the Ottomans. He'd won battles that should have been impossible. He'd crushed Ottoman armies at places like Niš and Kosovo. He'd earned the respect of friend and enemy alike. But by 1456, Hunyadi was 68 years old. He was exhausted. His body was breaking down from decades of campaigning, and he knew that time was running out. When word reached Hungary that Mehmed was gathering a massive army for an assault on Belgrade, Hunyadi sent desperate messages to every Christian power in Europe. He begged for reinforcements. He explained that if Belgrade fell, Hungary would fall. If Hungary fell, Vienna would be next. If Vienna fell, Germany would burn. The response was deafening silence. The kings of France and England were too busy fighting each other. The German princes were paralyzed by internal disputes. The Italians sent sympathetic letters, but no soldiers. Pope Calixtus III called for a crusade, but crusades require money and men. Europe had neither to spare. Hunyadi was on his own. He managed to scrape together about 3,000 regular soldiers. These were professional troops, experienced fighters who'd served in his campaigns before. But 3,000 men to hold a city against the largest army the Ottomans had ever fielded? The mathematics of siege warfare said it was impossible. You need at least one defender for every 3 attackers to hold walls. Mehmed was bringing 100,000 men. Hunyadi needed 33,000 defenders. He had 3,000. The numbers didn't just look bad. They looked like a death sentence. But then something unexpected happened. Something that changed the entire equation. Enter John of Capistrano. If you ask a Hollywood casting director to find someone to save Europe, they would not pick this man. John Capistrano was 70 years old. He was a Franciscan friar, a monk who'd spent most of his life preaching and organizing religious revivals. He was thin, frail, and suffered from chronic health problems. He should have been in Italy somewhere, writing sermons and preparing for a quiet death. Instead, he was riding through the villages of Hungary with a 12-foot wooden cross, giving speeches that made grown men weep. Capistrano wasn't a soldier. He'd never commanded troops. He'd never even held a sword until a few months earlier. But he had something far more powerful than military experience. He had charisma. He had the ability to make people believe that the impossible was possible. When Pope Calixtus called for a crusade to save Belgrade, he appointed Capistrano as his papal legate, his personal representative. Capistrano took the job seriously. He traveled from village to village across Hungary and the surrounding territories. He preached in town squares. He held mass in fields. He told the peasants that this wasn't just a war between kingdoms. It was a war between good and evil. He told them that if they died defending Belgrade, they would go straight to heaven. No purgatory, no waiting, instant salvation. And the peasants believed him. They left their farms. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Pitchforks, axes, clubs, hunting bows, rusty swords inherited from dead grandfathers. They had no armor. Most of them had no military training. They were farmers and shepherds and blacksmiths. But they followed Capistrano because he promised them that God was on their side. By the time Capistrano reached Belgrade in July of 1456, he had an army of sorts, 20,000 men. But calling them an army is generous. They were a mob. They were enthusiastic, yes. They were brave, yes. But they didn't know how to fight in formation. They didn't understand siege warfare. They were, in the eyes of professional soldiers like Hunyadi, more of a liability than an asset. When Hunyadi saw Capistrano's peasant crusaders marching toward Belgrade, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He knew that untrained men on city walls during a siege were just targets. They would panic when the cannons fired. They would break when the janissaries charged. They would die uselessly. But he also knew he didn't have a choice. He needed bodies on the walls. So he let Capistrano and his mob into the city. The plan was simple. The 3,000 professional soldiers would man the walls and do the actual fighting. The peasants would haul stones, carry water, and stay out of the way. It was the only logical arrangement. But as we're about to see, John of Capistrano had no intention of staying out of the way. On June 29th, 1456, the horizon went dark. The Ottoman army had arrived. Contemporary chroniclers describe a sight that must have been terrifying beyond comprehension. The Turkish camp stretched for miles. Thousands of white tents covered the plain like snow. The standards of 100 different units fluttered in the breeze. And in the center of it all, the massive guns. Mehmed II loved artillery. He'd used the largest cannons in the world to smash the walls of Constantinople 3 years earlier. Now he'd brought even bigger guns to Belgrade. The largest cannon reportedly required 60 oxen to move. It could fire a stone ball that weighed 600 pounds. When it fired, the sound could be heard 20 miles away. The engineers positioned these monsters on the hills overlooking the city. They built wooden platforms to stabilize them. They stockpiled mountains of stone shot. And then, on July 4th, they opened fire. The bombardment was apocalyptic. The cannons fired day and night. Each impact shook the ground. Stone walls that had stood for centuries began to crack. Entire sections of battlements collapsed into rubble. The defenders tried to patch the breaches with timber and earth, but the guns kept firing. For every section they repaired during the night, 2 more collapsed during the day. But Mehmed wasn't relying on artillery alone. He'd brought the full weight of Ottoman military science to bear. The engineers dug trenches that zigzagged toward the walls, providing cover for troops to advance. Sappers began tunneling under the fortifications, planning to collapse them with explosives. The Ottoman fleet on the Danube and Sava rivers blockaded the city from the water, cutting off any hope of resupply. And waiting in the camps, drilling and preparing, were the Janissaries. If you asked a European knight in 1456 to name the scariest soldiers on earth, they would say Janissaries without hesitation. These men were the product of a system so brutal that it barely seems real. The Ottomans had a practice called the devshirme, the blood tax. They would take Christian boys from conquered territories, usually between the ages of 8 and 12. These children would be forcibly converted to Islam and brought to Constantinople. The strongest and smartest were selected for intensive military training. They were taught to fight from childhood. They learned sword work, archery, discipline, and absolute obedience. They were forbidden to marry. They were forbidden to own property. They had no family except the Sultan, and no purpose except war. By the time they reached adulthood, they were the most professional soldiers in the world. They wore distinctive uniforms with tall white hats. They carried curved scimitars and composite bows, and they had never, ever broken in battle. At Constantinople, they'd climbed over mountains of their own dead to breach the walls. At Kosovo, they'd crushed the Serbs. At Varna, they'd annihilated a crusader army. They were the elite of the elite, and there were 12,000 of them camped outside Belgrade. Mehmed's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Pound the walls with artillery until breaches opened. Storm those breaches with Janissaries. Once inside, the professional soldiers would overwhelm the defenders. It had worked at Constantinople. It would work here. For 3 weeks, the siege ground on. The walls crumbled. The defenders died. The heat of summer turned the city into an oven. Water became scarce. Food ran low. Disease started spreading. And every day the Ottoman noose tightened. Hunyadi knew the city couldn't hold much longer. He sent messages to Capistrano, urging him to evacuate the peasant crusaders while there was still time. Better to save them for another fight than watch them die uselessly in a doomed city. But Capistrano refused. He told Hunyadi that they weren't leaving. He told his peasants that God had brought them here for a reason. He held masses on the walls while cannonballs screamed overhead. He led prayers in the streets while buildings collapsed around them. And somehow, impossibly, the defenders held. By mid-July, the Ottomans had created several large breaches in the walls. Mehmed ordered his commanders to prepare for the final assault. He wanted this finished. On July 21st, the bombardment reached a crescendo. Every gun fired at once. The entire southern wall of Belgrade seemed to explode. Massive sections collapsed into the ditches. The breaches were wide enough to march entire regiments through. And then the drums began. The Ottoman assault was coming. Mehmed committed everything. 12,000 Janissaries formed the spearhead. Behind them, waves of regular infantry, tens of thousands strong. Their orders were simple. Take the breaches. Kill everyone. Plant the Sultan's banner on the citadel. As the sun rose on July 22nd, the attack began. The Janissaries advanced in perfect formation. They didn't rush. They didn't shout war cries. They moved like a machine, shields locked, discipline absolute. When they reached the ditches, they scrambled down into the rubble-filled gaps and began climbing toward the breaches. On the walls, Hunyadi positioned his 3,000 professionals at the critical points. They had crossbows, spears, and grim determination. They knew this was the moment. If the Janissaries got through, it was over. The defenders poured everything into the breaches. Crossbow bolts, rocks, burning oil, anything that could kill or maim. The Janissaries climbed over their own dead without flinching. They reached the top of the breaches and began fighting hand to hand with the defenders. This was the nightmare scenario. Once it became a close-quarters brawl, training and discipline mattered. The Janissaries had both. The Hungarian regulars fought desperately, but they were being pushed back. Inch by inch, the Janissaries were winning. Mehmed, watching from his command post, must have been smiling. His plan was working. And then John of Capistrano did something insane. The 70-year-old monk climbed onto the wall. He was wearing his brown Franciscan robe. He held his giant wooden cross above his head like a battle standard, and he started screaming at his peasants. "Now! Now is the time! God wills it! They cannot pass!" The peasants, who'd been relegated to hauling supplies and staying out of the way, looked at the old monk. They looked at the Janissaries pouring through the breaches. They looked at the professional soldiers being pushed back, and something snapped. 20,000 untrained, unarmored peasants, armed with farm tools and hunting weapons, charged into the breaches. It was tactically idiotic. It violated every rule of siege warfare, but it worked. The sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed the Janissaries. They'd been trained to fight disciplined soldiers. They hadn't been trained to fight a human wave of screaming maniacs who had absolutely nothing to lose. The peasants swarmed over the Janissaries like ants on a beetle. They stabbed with pitchforks. They swung clubs. They bit and clawed and tackled. For every peasant who died, 2 more took his place. The Janissaries, for the first time in their history, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. Hunyadi, seeing the impossible happening, committed his reserves. His professional cavalry charged into the chaos. They hit the confused Janissaries from the side. The Ottoman elite, caught between the peasant mob and the Hungarian knights, broke. It wasn't a rout yet. It was just confusion. But confusion on a medieval battlefield spreads like wildfire. The Janissaries began pulling back toward the ditches. The regular Ottoman infantry, seeing their elite retreating, stopped advancing. And Capistrano, standing on the wall with his cross, saw the enemy waver. He made a decision that no sane commander would make. He ordered his peasants to pursue out of the city, into the Ottoman camp. Hunyadi reportedly screamed at him to stop. Sending untrained peasants out of the protection of the walls into the middle of 100,000 enemy soldiers was suicide. But Capistrano wasn't listening to military logic. He was listening to something else. He jumped down from the wall, grabbed a sword he'd never been trained to use, and charged through the breach. 20,000 peasants followed him. They poured out of Belgrade like water from a broken dam. They crashed into the Ottoman forces that were still trying to organize for their assault. The surprise was total. The Ottomans had expected a desperate defense. They hadn't expected a counterattack. They certainly hadn't expected an army of screaming peasants led by a 70-year-old monk. The mathematics of warfare say this should have been a massacre. 20,000 unarmored civilians against the professional Ottoman army? They should have been annihilated in minutes. But the Ottomans weren't ready. Their troops were scattered across the siege lines. Their cavalry was still in camp. Their cannons couldn't fire because their own men were in the way. And most critically, they were psychologically unprepared for what was happening. The Ottoman soldiers had spent 3 weeks watching Belgrade die slowly. They'd seen the walls crumble. They'd heard the screams of the defenders. They thought they were facing a broken enemy ready to surrender. Instead, they were facing a horde of maniacs who seemed to have no fear of death whatsoever. The battle that erupted outside Belgrade's walls was chaos incarnate. There were no formations, no tactics, just a massive, swirling melee that stretched across the plain. Capistrano charged through the Ottoman camp with his cross held high. He wasn't fighting, exactly. He was leading. The peasants saw him and followed. They overran Ottoman positions. They captured cannons. They set fire to supply wagons. The professional Ottoman troops tried to form defensive lines, but the sheer insanity of the situation made that impossible. And then, Hunyadi, realizing that he either had to support the peasants or watch them die, committed his entire professional force. 3,000 Hungarian cavalry and infantry poured out of Belgrade. They didn't charge in an organized attack. They just joined the brawl. What happened next shocked everyone, including the people who were doing it. The Ottoman army began to collapse, not from superior tactics or firepower, but from pure psychological pressure. The Sultan's soldiers couldn't understand what was happening. They'd been winning. The walls were breached. Victory was certain, and now they were fighting for their lives against an enemy that should have been too weak to resist. The Janissaries, Those unbeatable elite troops found themselves being pushed back by farmers with pitchforks. Ottoman officers tried to rally their men, but the panic was spreading. Soldiers began abandoning their positions. Some fled toward the river. Others ran for the camps. The retreat turned into a rout. By midday, the Ottoman army was in full flight. Mehmed II, watching from his command post, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His 100,000-man army was being driven off by 3,000 professionals and a mob of peasants. He personally tried to rally his troops. According to several accounts, he rode into the middle of the fleeing soldiers and tried to turn them around. He even drew his sword and threatened to kill deserters himself. But the psychological dam had burst. His men wouldn't fight. Some accounts say Mehmed was wounded in the thigh by an arrow during this attempt. Whether that's true or not, the result was the same. The Sultan was forced to retreat. The siege was broken. The casualties tell the story. The Ottomans lost somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 men. The exact number is debated by historians, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. The defenders of Belgrade lost roughly 2,000 killed and many more wounded, but they'd won against all logic, against all military science, against every prediction. They'd won. Mehmed retreated south. He took his massive cannons with him. He abandoned his supplies. He left behind his dead. And he never attempted another major invasion of Hungary during his lifetime. John Hunyadi didn't get to celebrate the victory. 3 weeks after the battle, he died. Some sources say it was plague that had broken out in the city. Others say it was simply exhaustion. The man who'd spent his entire life fighting the Ottomans died knowing he'd won his greatest victory, but he also died knowing how close it had been. John of Capistrano outlived Hunyadi by 3 months. He too died of plague. His last words were reportedly, "The Turks are driven off. My work is done." The Catholic Church canonized him in 1724. He's now Saint John of Capistrano, the patron saint of military chaplains. But the real victory at Belgrade wasn't about individual heroes. It was about what that victory meant for Europe. If Belgrade had fallen in 1456, the Ottoman road to Vienna would have been wide open. Mehmed II would have marched north. Hungary would have collapsed. Austria would have been next. The map of Europe would look completely different today. The siege of Belgrade bought Europe time. It proved that the Ottomans could be stopped. It showed that even the greatest war machine in the world had limits. But here's what the chroniclers of the time didn't understand. They saw Belgrade as a miracle. They saw it as divine intervention. They wrote that God had personally defended the city. And maybe they were right in a way. But the miracle wasn't supernatural. It was psychological. What John of Capistrano did was create a force multiplier out of belief itself. His peasants had no business being on a battlefield. They had no armor, no training, no discipline. But they had absolute conviction that they were fighting a holy war. They believed they couldn't lose. And that belief made them terrifying. The Janissaries had spent their lives training to fight soldiers. They knew how to counter tactics. They knew how to break formations. But they didn't know how to fight faith. When 20,000 men who genuinely believe they're going to heaven charge at you with pitchforks, military science stops working. The psychological impact is overwhelming. And that's the lesson of Belgrade. Wars aren't just won with cannons and cavalry. They're won in the minds of the soldiers. The Ottomans had the numbers. They had the technology. They had the professional army. But they didn't have the psychological edge. The defenders did. And in the brutal mathematics of siege warfare, that edge was worth 30,000 men. Let's talk about why the Ottoman defeat at Belgrade was so shocking. This wasn't a close battle. This wasn't a tactical setback. This was a complete reversal of everything that made sense militarily. The Ottoman Empire in 1456 was at its peak. Mehmed II had just conquered Constantinople 3 years earlier using the same exact strategy he brought to Belgrade. Massive artillery bombardment, followed by Janissary assault. It had worked against the greatest fortified city in the Christian world. There was no reason it shouldn't work against a mid-sized fortress on the Danube. The Ottomans had the finest military system in Europe. Their Janissaries were professional from childhood. Their artillery was the best in the world. Their logistics were so good they could keep 100,000 men fed and supplied hundreds of miles from home. Their intelligence network knew everything about their enemies. They should have crushed Belgrade like stepping on an ant. But they didn't account for the human element. They didn't account for John of Capistrano turning 20,000 civilians into a weapon. And most critically, they didn't account for their own psychological vulnerabilities. The Ottoman army in 1456 was overconfident. They'd won too many victories. They'd crushed too many enemies. When something unexpected happened, when the plan didn't work exactly as written, they didn't have a fallback. They panicked. And once the panic started, it spread like a plague through the entire army. This is the dark secret of military history. The best-trained armies in the world can break if you hit them at the right psychological moment. The Romans broke at Teutoburg Forest. The French knights broke at Agincourt. The Spanish tercios broke at Rocroi. And the Janissaries broke at Belgrade. In every case, it wasn't just about tactics or technology. It was about belief. The Romans believed the Germanic tribes were barbarians who couldn't fight. The French believed peasant archers couldn't kill armored knights. The Spanish believed their infantry square was invincible. The Ottomans believed a 70-year-old monk and 20,000 farmers couldn't possibly hurt them. They were all wrong, and the cost of that wrongness was measured in thousands of corpses. The siege of Belgrade changed the trajectory of European history in ways that are hard to overstate. After Belgrade, the Ottoman advance into Central Europe stalled for 70 years. Mehmed II never tried another major offensive into Hungary. His successors would eventually push north again under Suleiman the Magnificent, but the psychological damage of Belgrade lingered. The Ottoman military planners had learned that Hungary wasn't going to be easy. They learned that Christian Europe, when properly motivated, could fight back, and that lesson probably saved Vienna in 1529 when the first major Ottoman siege failed. But Belgrade also taught Europe a darker lesson. It taught them that professional armies weren't enough. If you wanted to stop the Ottomans, you needed fanatics. You needed people who believed so completely in their cause that death didn't scare them. This lesson would echo through the Reformation, through the wars of religion, through every conflict that followed. The age of professional, disciplined warfare was ending. The age of ideological warfare was beginning. And it all started because a 70-year-old monk decided that faith was a weapon. Think about the moment when Capistrano climbed that wall. He was old. He was sick. He had no military training. Every logical bone in his body should have told him to stay behind the walls where it was safe. But he didn't. He grabbed a cross and a sword and charged an army. That's not courage. That's something else. That's the kind of irrational commitment that changes history. Hunyadi was the better military mind. He understood siege warfare. He knew how to position troops and manage resources. If you ranked commanders by skill, Hunyadi was in the top tier. Capistrano wouldn't even make the list. But when the moment of crisis came, it was Capistrano who broke the siege. Because sometimes in history, skill matters less than will. Sometimes the person who refuses to accept reality is the one who changes it. The Janissaries were trained to fight soldiers. They weren't trained to fight ghosts. And that's what Capistrano's peasants must have looked like to them. A wave of screaming, impossible, suicidal maniacs who kept coming no matter how many you killed. It was a horror show, and it worked. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The 15th century was the hinge of history. It was the moment when the medieval world died and the modern world was born. Constantinople fell in 1453. The printing press was invented in 1450. Columbus would sail in 1492. Martin Luther would nail his theses to the door in 1517. Everything was changing. The old certainties were collapsing. And in the middle of this transformation, Belgrade happened. It proved that the new world wasn't going to be exclusively Ottoman. It proved that Europe still had a chance, and it bought time for that chance to develop. If you play the alternate history game, if Belgrade falls in 1456, does Europe survive? Maybe, probably, but it would look very different. The Protestant Reformation might not happen because half of Germany would be Ottoman. The Age of Exploration might not happen because Spain would be fighting for survival instead of sending ships to the Americas. The Scientific Revolution might not happen because the universities would be burned. Belgrade was the fulcrum on which history pivoted, and it was held by 3,000 professionals and 20,000 amateurs who believed in a crazy monk. The weapons and tactics at Belgrade tell us something important about the transition from medieval to early modern warfare. Mehmed brought cannons, big ones. The kind that could knock down stone walls that had stood for centuries. This was the future. Gunpowder artillery would dominate warfare for the next 400 years. But the defenders used crossbows, spears, and muscle. This was the past. And somehow, the past won. Why? Because technology only matters if you can deploy it correctly. Mehmed's cannons destroyed the walls. They did exactly what they were designed to do. But once the walls were breached, the battle became a melee. And in a melee, a crossbow is just as good as a gun. A spear is just as good as a sword. And 20,000 determined farmers are worth more than 10,000 confused professionals. The lesson here is that military history isn't a straight line of progress. It's not always true that the side with better technology wins. Sometimes the side with better morale wins. Sometimes the side with crazier leadership wins. And sometimes a 70-year-old monk with a wooden cross defeats the largest army in the world because he convinced 20,000 people that God was on their side. The aftermath of Belgrade is worth examining because it shows the limits of even the greatest victories. The city was saved. The Ottomans retreated. Europe breathed a sigh of relief. But Hungary was still broke. The kingdom was still divided. The nobility still cared more about their own power than the national defense. John Hunyadi died 3 weeks after the battle. John of Capistrano died 3 months later. The two men who'd made the miracle happen were gone, and without them, Hungary slowly fell apart. Within 70 years, most of Hungary would be conquered by the Ottomans anyway. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 would shatter the kingdom. By 1541, Buda would fall. The Ottomans would occupy Hungary for 150 years. So, did Belgrade matter? Was it just delaying the inevitable? No, because those 70 years mattered. They gave Austria time to fortify Vienna. They gave the Holy Roman Empire time to organize its defense. They gave Protestant princes time to build their armies. When the Ottomans finally pushed north again, Europe was ready. The victory at Belgrade in 1456 made the successful defense of Vienna in 1529 possible, and the defense of Vienna made the eventual rollback of Ottoman power possible. History is a chain. Each link matters. Belgrade was a critical link. Without it, the chain breaks. Let's talk about the human cost. 2,000 defenders died at Belgrade. That's 2,000 men who left behind wives, children, parents, 2,000 families destroyed. The chroniclers don't tell us their names. They don't tell us their stories. They were just numbers in a ledger of victory. But each one was a person who made a choice to stand on that wall knowing they'd probably die. Think about that choice. You're a Hungarian peasant. You're 30 years old. You've got a wife and 3 kids. You're not rich, but you're not starving. You've got a little plot of land. Life is hard but bearable. Then a crazy old monk shows up in your village and tells you that the Turks are coming. He tells you that if you fight, you'll go to heaven. If you don't fight, your family will be enslaved. What do? Some men ran. The chroniclers don't talk about them. Some men hid. History forgets them. But thousands of men picked up whatever weapons they could find and marched to Belgrade. They left their families. They left their farms. They left their lives. And most of them never came back. The survivors returned to find their fields overgrown, their homes falling apart, their children grown. They got no pensions, no parades, no monuments. They just went back to work and tried to pretend that what they'd seen and done at Belgrade was normal. It wasn't normal. It was hell. And they walked through it anyway. The siege of Belgrade reminds us that history isn't made by nations or ideologies or economic forces. It's made by individuals making choices. John Hunyadi chose to defend an indefensible city. John of Capistrano chose to preach when he should have been resting. 20,000 peasants chose to fight when they could have run. Mehmed II chose to retreat when he could have regrouped and tried again. Each of those choices mattered. Each one changed the trajectory of everything that followed. And that's the real lesson of Belgrade. You're not powerless. You're not just a statistic in someone else's history. When the moment comes, when the walls are breaching and the enemy is at the gate, you have a choice. You can stand or you can run. And sometimes, impossibly, standing works. Picture the scene one more time. It's July 22nd, 1456. The sun is setting. The battle is over. You're standing on the walls of Belgrade again. You're covered in blood and dust. Some of it is yours. Most of it isn't. You look out at the plain below. The Ottoman camp is burning. The enemy is fleeing. The cannons that had been pounding your walls for 3 weeks are silent. You look to your left and see the old monk, John of Capistrano. He's leaning on his cross like a crutch. He's exhausted. He's barely standing, but he's smiling. You look to your right and see John Hunyadi. His armor is dented. His sword is broken. He's not smiling. He knows the cost. He knows that Hungary is still in danger. He knows that this victory is temporary. But for now, for this moment, you've won. 3,000 professionals and 20,000 amateurs just beat 100,000 Ottomans. The experts said it was impossible. The chroniclers will call it a miracle. But you know the truth. It wasn't a miracle. It was will. It was 23,000 men who refused to accept defeat. It was a 70-year-old monk who turned faith into a weapon. It was a veteran general who gambled everything on one last battle. It was ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they had no other choice. That's what happened at Belgrade in 1456. That's the true power of Europe. Not the castles or the cannons or the cavalry. The power is in the people who refuse to quit. The power is in the moment when logic says you should surrender and you say no. The power is in believing that the impossible is just difficult. And sometimes, just sometimes, that belief is enough. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most underrated battles in European history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Siege of Belgrade, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel survive the algorithm. Make sure you're subscribed and have the bell notification turned on so you don't miss our next documentary. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Belgrade deserves to be remembered alongside battles like Tours and Vienna? Would Europe have survived if the Ottomans had won? Let's discuss it down below. Until next time, remember that history is not just about what happened, it's about who had the courage to stand when everyone else was running.